The following episode is a part of Different Perspectives series with Marissa Reeder and Stephanie Wells, and we'll focus on the benefits and drawbacks of carnivore and vegan diets. We'll talk about the different types of fats, proteins, and sugars and their effects on our body, misinformation surrounding health, and how we can increase the quality of our life through healthy eating. Marissa is a licensed nutritionist both nationally and in the state of Minnesota, and in addition to seeing clients, she studies and writes about alternative medicine, nutrition science, and carnivore and animal-based ways of eating. Stephanie is a vegan registered dietitian in Texas with a strong passion for helping vegans eat healthfully. She's been vegan since 2014, and while she was initially drawn to a vegan diet for its health benefits, she has come to appreciate the benefits it has for animal welfare and the environment. So I just want to start with defining the terms carnivore and vegan, because I still believe in our culture there's a lot of confusion around those. Recently, I saw a video with a singer, Alicia Keys, and she was doing vegan pancakes. And the first thing she said was, okay, let's get some eggs and then let's get some vegan butter and vegan milk. So I'm like, she doesn't understand what vegan is. And then carnivore, obviously, a lot of people are familiar with Jordan Peterson and his diet of eating beef only and salt and water. So I just want to clarify, Marissa, what you mean by carnivore. So Stephanie, if you want to start talking about vegan, and then Marissa.
Sure. So a vegan diet is really defined as the avoidance of any animal products. So that would be any meat products, the flesh of an animal. It would also include foods that are made from animals. So something like milk that's taken from a cow or butter that's made from milk. Usually it also includes the avoidance of honey. That's considered to come from, a living organism. So most vegans would also avoid honey. And really what vegan diets are based on are fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains, nuts and seeds, any kind of plant-based food.
Okay, perfect. A tricky question. How about cultured meat, right? Meat that's grown in a lab. It's made of animal cells, so it's actual meat, but it doesn't affect animals. It doesn't affect climate change. What about that?
Yeah, that is a really tough question to answer. Just because I think, cultured meat hasn't really been around that long yet. I think we're still having conversations around that. And I think it's probably going to depend on the person. So I think, somebody who's been vegan for a long time, I think they would be more hesitant to, I guess, want to eat cultured meat just because I think the longer you do it, people tend to get a little grossed out by the thought of eating animal products. And
Yeah.
so I think for that kind of person, they wouldn't really be into it so much. But for somebody who is going vegan because of, reasons for the environment or reasons of just wanting to improve the welfare of animals, I think they might be really willing to try it. But yeah, as of right now, I don't think there's a real consensus on that.
Okay, cool. Marissa?
Okay, so obviously my diet that I propose is basically the opposite. It's mostly eating animal foods. There's kind of a range in my field. So like you said, there's people like Jordan Peterson and some others that do mostly just beef or just meat. The more extreme version is called beef water salt, and that's a diet that people use for healing digestive disease and autoimmune disease. Putting autoimmune into remission basically is the most common reason.
Mm-hmm.
And then I propose, with my clients, basically two different versions of animal-based diets. One is called carnivore and the other is called animal-based. And basically the main difference is carnivore is generally including all different animal products into the diet. So rather than just beef, water, salt, we're also including chicken and eggs and fish and things like that. This has really evolved just in the last few years. More and more people in the carnivore community are now adding less toxic plant foods into the diet. So this has become commonly known as animal-based. I think the term was actually coined by Dr. Paul Saladino, the carnivore MD, he famously added fruit and honey. Even some people are adding squash, sweet potato, and even some safe starches, as they're known, including cooked carrot and sometimes even white rice. So this diet is basically based on animal products. It's still probably 70 to 80% or more animal foods. And then people are adding back in some carbohydrate, like fruit and honey primarily.
So when you mention non-toxic plant-based food, is it mainly like raw ingredients, fruit and vegetables? Or is there any, like tofu, would it be non-toxic as well or not?
Nope. So the most toxic foods from plants are generally seed-based. So the way I think about food is 3 columns. Number 1 would be all the foods that are the healthiest for the human diet. Things our ancestors ate, a hunter-gatherer, primal tribal cultures ate a lot of meat and fruit. So those would be the healthiest and least toxic foods for the human body. And then column 2 is foods that most people can eat without having much damage. They're not very high nutrient, but they're also not very damaging to the gut. And then column 3 would be all foods that are incredibly damaging to the human body. They're not things our ancestors ever ate. They're basically causing damage every time we eat them. And most of those foods are from seeds. Seeds are where plants put a lot of the toxins. You can imagine the plant doesn't want the seeds to be digested. So they pass through the digestive system whole, then they're planted in the waste. So most of the highly toxic plant foods, the most toxic foods that we can possibly eat, are derived from seeds.
Interesting. And that includes not just ground seeds, but also like flour, but also just pure like nuts, for example. That's also harmful. Okay. Stephanie.
Right,
yeah.
Oh, I was just going to explain a little more. The only seed that the plant wants us to eat are seeds that are in fruit. So you can imagine the definition of fruit is the fleshy part of the plant that contains the seeds. And when animals eat, like an apple or a banana, they're actually consuming the seeds and then they pass through the system undigested and come out whole in the waste. There are seeds that are damaging basically when they are ground up, and the most damaging seeds would include grains, beans, nuts, seeds, and especially seed oils. The fats from seeds are incredibly damaging to the human body.
Stephanie, I assume you disagree with that?
Yeah, I would disagree with that. I would disagree with that based on just like the scientific evidence that we have so far. I think especially with seed oils, when we look at research that has been done where they take people and they replace some of the saturated fat in their diet with seed oils, we actually see inflammatory markers, so levels of inflammation in the body go down. So I don't think there's a lot of really evidence to support the claim that seed oils are inflammatory. A lot of them are very rich in polyunsaturated fats. And for humans, really, there's not really much of an issue with seeds not being digested, like coming out whole. I think there's an exception with flax seeds. If you eat, whole flax seeds, they're very hard to digest. And so that's why we recommend people eat them ground. But then also in terms of things like beans and grains, Marissa, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think you're talking about the levels of phytic acid, lectins that they contain, things like that. And so what we know is that lectins and phytic acid are not really a huge concern for health. It is true that they can act as sort of anti-nutrients. What that means is they can sometimes block the body from absorbing certain minerals like zinc quite as well. But the main issue with lectins, I would say, so those are commonly found in foods like beans, raw grains, some nightshade vegetables. They're also present in small amounts in some seafood and some dairy. What you really find is with lectins, when you cook your beans really well, they're fully cooked, almost 100% of the lectins are deactivated. So they're not really going to be causing any sort of toxic effects. Really, the main toxic effects we've seen is when people eat undercooked red kidney beans. they can feel very sick and have a lot of digestive distress. But when your beans are fully cooked, or if you're buying canned beans, it's not really an issue. And really what we see in terms of the scientific evidence that we have, diets that contain these foods are incredibly healthy. They're associated with decreased risks of things like heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes. So I don't really think we can say that these kinds of foods are toxic. I think they're actually very health promoting.
So would you say that all seed oils are good, or just some of them?
Yeah, so they definitely differ in their nutrition content. So some are higher in, I guess, polyunsaturated fats than others. I wouldn't say any of them are inflammatory. Some of them are higher in omega-3 fatty acids, which we know are anti-inflammatory. They can have really great benefits for the brain and the heart. So that would be things like canola oil, for example, is a good source of omega-3 fatty acids, that sort of thing. So they do differ, but I wouldn't say that any are inherently damaging to the body.
Mm-hmm. Marissa, you wrote a blog post on seed oils, and you say the opposite. You say that polyunsaturated fats are the worst thing for you. So can you elaborate on that?
I sure can. Yeah, I wrote a college-style research paper that I just published last month with about 20 to 30 different scientific studies, and it was really fascinating and fun to write. I found that most of the studies that Stephanie's referring to right now, and that a lot of vegans and vegetarians use to justify the switch from animal-based foods to plant-based foods, are primarily observational studies. So the science of epidemiology is really not very well respected. It's mostly used in the creation of hypotheses and never to be used in discussions of causation. And so a lot of vegans and vegetarians are making, and even just people that, work in nutrition and healthcare in general, are making statements like Stephanie just made, where, we replace saturated fat with seed oils and don't see any, health problems. And that's not actually true. So there really aren't any interventional studies where they're replacing animal fats with plant fats. Almost all of the studies that are referred to in this field are these observational studies. And so it's really not very strong science. What studies we need to be looking at are randomized controlled trials, where they're interventional trials. And there's numerous interventional trials that show no correlation with saturated fat and heart disease, and no benefit to biomarkers for health to switching to seed oils. And one of the major problems in the field is that seed oils are so prevalent. There was actually mass lobbying done in the 80s from the soybean oil farmers and the corn oil farmers to the American government, and they succeeded in switching all of the deep fryers in the US, 99% of them, to seed oils in 1984. So before that, McDonald's French fries were cooked in beef tallow, and movie theater popcorn was cooked in coconut oil. And so since 1984, seed oils have become so prevalent. And you can imagine these are not foods that were ever part of the human diet prior to civilization. We wouldn't in the wild ever press the oil out of a soybean or even eat grains. I mean, a lot of these seed-based foods like grains and beans are the newest foods to be added to the human diet. We don't have a gizzard. We are not grainivores. We are not designed to eat grains. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. They hunted primarily ruminant animals and gathered primarily fruit and eggs. And so these seed oils, they do these studies, and there isn't a control group because everyone is eating them. You go to a restaurant these days, and on average, the calories in a restaurant meal are 40% seed oils. So there isn't a control group because the damage starts at 2% of the diet. So you really have to get your levels down to 1% or less for the healing to happen and for the detoxification of these polyunsaturated fats to occur. So all the studies done on seed oils that are interventional, the control group is at 4 or 5% of dietary calories, and the damage is already occurring. So newer studies coming out are really fascinating, showing how damaging polyunsaturated fats are to the human body.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned evolution. I, again, read your blog post, and you say that before agriculture, we found skeletons that were like 100 years old, right? And so that is a proof that before we introduced grains in our diet, we actually had the capacity to live much longer if we weren't eaten by an animal or died of, some other conditions. So, Stephanie, can you talk about like the evolution argument? Why do you think that humans can easily process seeds if we were never meant to eat them in the first place?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. I definitely wouldn't say that that's an area where I'm an expert in, definitely, in terms of, evolutionary biology and that sort of thing. But I do know, there's the paleo diet is still pretty popular, and one of the rationales is that, our Paleolithic ancestors didn't eat grains or any kind of, foods that are grown via agriculture. And I remember studies coming out where anthropologists were saying that they actually discovered that our Paleolithic ancestors did eat grains, more plant-based foods than originally were thought. So I guess I don't really understand why we would use the fact that maybe our older ancestors didn't eat as much plant-based foods as a rationale for saying that we can't digest them or that we shouldn't eat them. I don't think that it necessarily means that they're bad for us. It just means maybe they weren't as common, in the past.
Mm-hmm. So if I am vegan for various reasons, what products would you recommend that I eat? Like in terms of soy, seed oils, in terms of different types of milks, what are the healthiest versions?
Sure. So what I like to do is I suggest people really base a vegan diet mainly on whole, unprocessed plant foods. So that would be things like your beans and your lentils, soy foods as well, things like, tofu, tempeh, edamame, those sorts of things. Also including nuts and seeds for healthy fats, healthy unsaturated fats for the heart, and then also including a good mix of different fruits and vegetables as well. Those are kind of the main plant-based foods that I like people to base their diet on. As far as non-dairy milks, they do definitely differ. I like to recommend soy milk primarily, just because it's the closest in terms of nutrition to what you would typically get from dairy milk. So it provides a great amount of protein. And really, most of the non-dairy milks today are fortified with calcium and vitamin D, some with vitamin A as well. So the nutrition is pretty close. I'd say really where they mostly differ is in terms of their protein content. So that's why I like to recommend soy milk or pea milk is one that's a little bit more common recently. Then there's also some different blends. Like I've seen blends of like almond and coconut milk that have added pea protein in there. But it's really up to the person and what they're choosing to use the non-dairy milk for. If you're getting enough protein without it, I think it's fine to choose like an oat milk or an almond milk. But in general, I find that some vegans really are not prioritizing the protein, and they really could be doing a little bit better. So that's why I usually like to recommend the soy or pea milk for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So a lot of the times, when you buy almond milk, oat milk, soy milk, you have these added ingredients in it. And I just want to understand what is it, right? So you have like guar gum and pectin and locust bean gum and all these ingredients. Like why is it added to the milk? What does it do to you?
Yeah, so those are, I believe, typically added as kind of a thickener, just to provide a texture that is more similar to dairy milk, to make it a little less watery, I guess is the easiest way to describe it. Just to give it a better texture.
So they're not harmful in any way?
I don't think they're harmful. I don't think we've seen any scientific evidence that proves that. And they're present in pretty small amounts. I really don't think they're much cause for concern.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good to know. And Marissa, what do you say about people who drink dairy milk? Is dairy milk good for you? Is it part of the carnivore diet, or would you completely remove it because it causes inflammation, all these things?
I'm not a real big fan of pasteurized dairy products. I think we heat them to extremely high temperatures. Sometimes pasteurization can be as high as 500 degrees. And largely this practice started when they changed the diets for the cows. They were feeding them things like beer byproducts and things that were really unhealthy for cows.
Mm-hmm.
And milk was growing unhealthy levels of certain bacteria. So they started pasteurizing. I'm actually a really big fan of raw dairy. I think the carnivore diet generally does not include much dairy. Animal-based is now really incorporating a lot of raw dairy. So I've fed my family raw dairy for a long time. I have to.
And what's raw dairy?
So it hasn't been pasteurized or heated at all. It's fresh out of the cow. So I actually have to order it straight from the farmer and go to a raw milk pickup because it's illegal to sell raw milk in the stores.
No way. It's illegal.
Illegal.
So why is it illegal?
Because 100 years ago, when they were feeding the cows these really unhealthy beer byproducts, the milk was making people sick, so they started pasteurizing it. This became so widespread that the government was starting to prevent them from being able to sell raw dairy in grocery stores. I think you can in California, but a lot of states you cannot. So you have to buy it straight from the farmer. So I actually buy raw milk from an Amish farmer. And I get eggs from farmers as well so that they are corn-free and soy-free. But I find it really interesting that in the vegan and vegetarian community, there's so often this push toward eating foods that look like animal foods. I'm not in the practice of taking my meat and making it look like vegetables. So it's funny to me that there are all these plant-based milks and fake meat, Beyond Burgers, and all of these things. You know, really those ingredients are incredibly unhealthy. They actually did a study recently where they compared fake meat to dog food, and some of the worst dog food kibble on the market. The ingredients are virtually identical. So I just think that there's a push from our evolutionary brains to eat things that mimic more what our ancestors ate. And when we move to a plant-based diet, which is not something that our ancestors ever would have eaten, I mean, there are no primitive cultures or tribal cultures that do not eat meat. In fact, pretty much every tribal culture that we've ever studied eats a diet based on animal foods. There's no vegan or vegetarian tribal cultures at all. No evidence.
I think there are a few that are religious ones. For religious reasons, they don't eat animals. And that this dates back to like 5,000 years ago.
So I'm talking about like pre-civilized tribal cultures. So civilization started about 10,000 years ago with the invention of grain foods. So in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, humans found grains. This is 10,000 years ago. It didn't become widespread across the planet until more like 2,000 years ago. So we've been Homo sapiens for 300,000 years. We've been primates for 4 million. That's when meat eating started, is 4 million years ago, when we became primate, you know, when we evolved as that form of primate. And so if you think about starting to eat grains, you know, widespread 2,000 years ago, I mean, if you think about like the daily clock analogy, it's 11:59 and 59 seconds when we started eating grains. And so what a lot of people think of as, you know, our ancestors, where, you know, you live to be 30, you know, it's the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, like that's all way more recent than what I'm talking about. I'm talking pre-grain eating, pre-civilization, when we were still hunter-gatherer nomad tribal cultures, which is 99.9% of our evolutionary history. And those people ate meat and they ate fruit.
Have you always practiced carnivore diet, or have you evolved into it?
No, thank you for asking. I started out as a vegetarian and then a vegan. My undergrad was in social work. So when I was in my 20s, I was working as a social worker, and then I started taking some restaurant jobs and got interested in food and nutrition. Like most people, I didn't understand anything about our evolution, and I thought that if I wanted to change my diet, that I should become a vegetarian. So I cut out meat. I was a vegetarian for 4 years. And I was a vegan for a year. Toward the end, I became very extreme. I was a raw foodist for a while. And I spent a summer as a fruitarian. So I only ate fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds in their raw state. I became extremely unhealthy. I weighed about 105 pounds. I was really malnourished. I think I had severe protein deficiency. I got really sick. And, you know, a lot of my clients that I work with today are recovering vegetarians and vegans who have added animal products back into their diet. There's actually Facebook groups and whole communities of people that are recovering vegans and vegetarians because of health reasons. A lot of people get, I mean, some of these are even discussed on Stephanie's blog. There's B12 deficiency, there's protein deficiency. A lot of people, their hair will start falling out. They'll start developing autoimmune disease, digestive upset, SIBO, which is bloating from small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, because our digestive systems are not designed to digest all of these plants. Meat is digested in the stomach and plants are digested in the small intestine and large intestine. Mm-hmm. We have a carnivorous digestive system. It's confusing because 4 million years ago, the primates that we evolved from did eat mostly fruit. They were frugivores. And then humans became Homo sapiens because of adding meat to the diet. This is what allowed us to have these very large brains and to become the people that we are today. But our systems are damaged from eating all these plant foods for the last couple thousand years. And so, you know, humans have the most acidic stomach in the animal kingdom. We have the same acidity as a lion or a dog. So there's a lot of evidence. I mean, the fact that
what does that mean to have an acid stomach? What does it do? Mm-hmm. What's the difference?
Yeah, so stomach acid is completely based on the amount of animal foods that an animal consumes. The closer to carnivore or scavengers that ate carrion, so that's like rotten meat that they would find, they have the most acidic stomachs in the animal kingdom. So, you know, as you move toward straight herbivores, like ruminant animals that eat grass, they have very little stomach acidity and they have multiple stomachs. We do not have a system like that at all. We have carnivorous digestive systems. And there's some evidence that we also historically ate quite a bit of fruit as well. We can see the colors of the rainbow. We're attracted to fruit. We have the right enzymes in our saliva, but a lot of people have stomach damage from all the plant eating. So a lot of my clients, I have to help them heal their gut lining in order to be able to digest the meat, you know, sufficiently. And so we add things like apple cider vinegar to increase stomach acidity and to help heal the gut. So the body can switch from the plant eating that has been pushed for so many years now to back what our ancestors did, which was to eat mostly animal products.
And you also mentioned that we feed animals seeds, and that also is affected in the meat that we eat then. And right. Cows are the only animals that have 4 stomachs and that actually are able to process the seeds, right? So cows are king. They are the best meat to eat for carnivores, right?
Right. So our ancestors, when we were hunter-gatherers, mostly ate ruminant animals. So these are animals that consume grass, that are very large, very slow-moving. You can imagine if you were a tribal culture and you were hunting, you would want to kill a buffalo. So it's not just cows, it's all ruminant animals that are polygastric. So that means they have multiple stomachs. This is red meat. So this includes deer, sheep, you know, bison, all of these larger animals that are grass eating. And so when polygastric animals consume seeds, which they do, even in eating grass, they'll eat some grass seeds, their bodies are able to convert unhealthy, weak, bent, liquid, polyunsaturated fats into firm, strong, solid, saturated fat, which is the preferred fat for the human body. So things like cows and chickens, as well as humans, are monogastric. That means we have one stomach. When we eat seed oils, our bodies can't convert them to saturated fat, so we store them as seed oils. Same with the pigs and the chickens. So 99% of farmers these days feed their animals corn oil, soybean oil, soy byproducts. And so these animals store all of that. So when we eat a pig or a chicken from the grocery store, we're eating up to 30% seed oils because these animals
Oh.
store them. So that's why it's best for humans to get the majority of our fat from cows or other ruminant animals, because it's going to be very firm, strong, healthy, saturated fat.
That's good to know. Stephanie, can you talk about your journey? How did you become vegan? And then we can dive into meats and why you don't eat meat.
Sure, of course. So I would say I got into it when I was an undergrad. I had started to get really more interested in what it means to, eat a healthy diet. I know I had a lot of family members who had a lot of health problems that were really related to lifestyle. For example, I know that my mom had to get gastric bypass surgery when I was in high school. And, it was really concerning. It was a big thing that happened. And so I started trying to learn, okay, well, how do I eat healthy? Like, I don't want to have anything like that. I don't want to go through something like that. So I kind of got more interested in nutrition. I switched my major to nutrition after a couple of years in my undergrad. And I really got more interested in veganism. Really for the health benefits, just learning in school about all the benefits that plant-based foods can have. But I got into it pretty gradually. I would say that the first thing I kind of stopped eating was dairy. I realized that that was a big acne trigger for me. And so cutting that out really helped my skin a lot. And it's not a trigger for everyone. It definitely doesn't cause acne in everybody, but I noticed that for me, it did. It was a big factor.
Did you do tests or did you self-diagnose?
So yeah, it's interesting. So I really that's all I did was cut out dairy. I cut out milk and cheese. And I noticed some improvements in my skin right away. It's interesting because a few years later, I went on this study abroad trip with my college. I wasn't vegan yet at that time. And so, kind of like traveling, it's hard to stick to a certain diet. And I was like, okay, well, if I have to eat something with dairy, it's not going to be a problem. I'll just, that'll be fine. But at the end of the trip, my skin was so much worse. And that was really the only thing that I changed about my diet on that trip. So to me, that kind of gave me some confirmation that it was the dairy. But yeah, I don't know. I made a vegetarian friend at college. She really kind of got me more interested in the animal welfare aspect of things. So yeah, it was kind of gradual over a few years. I would say the last thing I cut out was probably eggs. I feel like that's a hard one for a lot of people. When you're used to
especially there's no real replacement. Yeah,
it's tough. So it took me a little while, but I love it. I feel so much better. I don't have the stomach problems that I used to have. Got a lot of energy, and I just feel good doing it. So yeah.
Would you say that for some people carnivore can work better and for others it's vegan diet? Or would you say that for everyone vegan is better?
Yeah, I would say overall, in terms of a dietary pattern, I think basing your diet on as many plant-based foods as possible is really going to give you the optimal health benefits. There is some nuance there. So for example, maybe somebody with IBS would have trouble tolerating, certain plant-based foods like, beans. That might be really hard for them. Some people might have issues with soy. And so I don't want to say it's, perfect for every person. There's probably some nuance, and you'd have to figure out, which foods are good for you, which, can cause problems. But I think just based on really the overwhelming state of the scientific literature that we have, we see that diets that are more based on plant-based foods have really great health benefits. So you see this from things like the Mediterranean diet, which I know it's kind of gotten a little bit of criticism. Some people say it's not a real diet. It's kind of taken on, it takes different components from different areas in the Mediterranean. It's not like the way that it's researched isn't really the way that, somebody in Italy actually eats, that sort of thing. But yeah, the
You mean
Mediterranean diet
is Mediterranean mainly based on like olive oil and fish, lean protein? What
yeah,
is it?
so it's not a vegetarian or vegan eating pattern, but it is primarily plant-based. So yeah, they focus a lot on fresh fruits and vegetables, healthy fats from olives and olive oil, really low intake of red meat, not zero intake, but yeah, more of the focus on fish and beans as well. So it's a primarily plant-based pattern that has been studied. We see that it has really great benefits for heart health, for the prevention of type 2 diabetes. We see that also with something like the DASH diet, which was developed to help people manage high blood pressure. It really focuses a lot on fruits and vegetables, beans, whole grains. Does include, some low-fat dairy, some leaner proteins like chicken and things like that. But really is focused a lot on the plant-based foods. So I would say I would be really hesitant to recommend a carnivore diet for really anybody. And I would say a main reason is because of cancer risk. So we see from the World Health Organization, they actually classify red meat as, I think it's a group 2A carcinogen, which means that it's a probable carcinogen. So it is likely to promote cancer development in humans. And really just seeing that, I don't know, I would be really hesitant to recommend a diet that's so heavy in red meat, Yeah, I think it's really low. It can be really low in fiber. Fiber has really important benefits for heart health, for prevention of diabetes, prevention of cancer. Fiber is really important for gut health as well. So we know that people who eat diets higher in fiber tend to have healthier bacteria in their gut microbiome. It's associated with less inflammation, stronger immunity, and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I eat oats every morning, and that is hopefully a good source of fiber.
For sure.
But I would be curious, Marissa, to hear your thoughts on red meat being seen as a carcinogen by all these organizations. Is there any truth to it? Have you done any research?
I sure have. And I absolutely think there's no truth to it at all. The studies used by the WHO in their conclusion that red meat has links to cancer are all observational studies. There's absolutely no interventional studies whatsoever with any of these links. I think that cancer, if you even just think about the basics of cancer, these are cells that only consume glucose. That's how they determine where the tumors are present in your body. They give you radioactive glucose, and wherever the cells are consuming this lights up on the scan, and that's how you know where the tumors are. So tumors do not consume red meat. It's just illogical. I actually have a study that I pulled up for this because I figured it would come up today. It's a meta-analysis that came out 10 years ago, prospective studies, red meat consumption and cancer. And they found no links whatsoever. And in most of these studies, actually, the more recent, well-done ones are actually finding that eating higher amounts of red meat is protective against cancer. And just in general, Stephanie brought up that people with IBS need to avoid beans and soy. And I think
it's not quite what I said. I think it just depends on the individual. Certain foods might be a little bit difficult, but it might be okay for some people.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. Eating beans and soy is incredibly hard for people to digest that have intestinal damage because beans and soy are 70% indigestible fiber. I disagree strongly that fiber is good for the human body. Like I said, plants have to be digested in the intestines, and meat is digested in our very acidic stomachs. Our ancestors ate mostly very easy to digest animal foods that were very low in fiber. So I think the studies on fiber are also largely observational. And you have to think about with observational studies, like even with the Mediterranean diet that you were referring to, this is just something that we've observed. We cannot make any causative inference from these observations because there's something called healthy user bias. And that's that people who, think they're eating a healthy diet and are eating more fruits and vegetables are also partaking in a lot of other healthy behaviors like exercise, like, you know, other confounding factors. They're not smoking. So we can't look at an observational study and determine anything causative, because, you know, who eats a hamburger these days without also including mayonnaise, French fries fried in vegetable oil, a large soda? I mean, we don't have studies observationally where we look at cultures that aren't consuming other unhealthy foods. And so, you know, if you look at the Mediterranean diet, I think the reason that it's done so well in a lot of observational studies is because people in the Mediterranean do not eat seed oils. So there's something called the French paradox and the Italian paradox, where you look at these countries, they're eating huge amounts of pasta, huge amounts of cholesterol and saturated fat, lots of meat, lots of cheese, lots of very heavy foods.
Lots of bread.
Lots of bread. And they have extremely low levels of all metabolic disease. So obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, cancer, stroke, diabetes. Why is that? They eat almost no seed oils. So when you go to a restaurant in the US, the only things you can order and be sure that they're not saturated in seed oils are burgers and steaks. They're almost never fried in oil. So those are the only foods I can eat when I go out to eat, besides maybe, you know, a baked potato with butter, or sometimes I'll get a salad, although I try not to eat lettuce because I think it's really damaging to my gut, and I avoid fiber in general. But, you know, if you go to France and you order at a restaurant, you can get almost anything on the entire menu and know that not only are you not eating seed oils, but the animal foods that you're eating weren't fed seed oils either. And so it's an extremely high saturated fat diet. And if you are interested in observational studies, you have to take all of these into account. Why does this French paradox exist? If saturated fat and cholesterol are the cause of heart disease, which I firmly believe they are not, then why are we seeing such low levels of heart disease in the countries that eat the most saturated fat and cholesterol? It's nonsensical.
Yeah, to comment on the observational studies, I definitely agree with you that, yeah, observational studies tend to be used a lot for generating scientific hypotheses. They can't be used to determine causation. But with observational studies, a lot of the times what researchers can do is they can control for different variables. You know, some do a better job of this than others. But I'll see lots of studies where the researchers say in the paper, they control for different lifestyle factors. They control for smoking. If they have a lot of data on the diet, they can control for things like, you know, saturated fat intake, cholesterol intake, intake of just all of these different things. And that really helps them in their results determine whether or not their results are, you know, really, I guess, as accurate as possible, that they're not being influenced by other factors that may, you know, be influencing the results. So there's definitely statistical methods that researchers can use to, you know, when they're looking at the results of the observational studies. I don't think that we can totally dismiss them, especially when we have so many studies over time confirming the same information. And then I would also say about dietary fiber, you know, it's true that the human body itself cannot digest fiber, but that's what our gut bacteria do. We have a whole host of gut bacteria in our system called, you know, the gut microbiota. The bacteria is actually what ferments the dietary fiber, and it actually produces a lot of really healthful components like short-chain fatty acids. We know that it's related to the immune system. So even if human body itself can't digest the fiber, we all have bacteria in our intestines that can.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about, because we were talking about meat. So Stephanie, what is your main source of protein? Is it beans and rice? Do you recommend any meat alternatives like Beyond, Impossible, which Marissa has touched upon, or is it bad for you?
Sure. For me, the main sources of protein in my diet tend to be beans and legumes. So I eat a lot of, you know, black beans, chickpeas, lentils, things like that. I also include a lot of soy foods in my diet. I think soy foods are a really great quality source of protein. So I do eat a lot of tofu, tempeh, edamame. I also drink soy milk during the day. That adds some protein as well. And then you do get some from grains as well. So, you know, quinoa is a really great source, but any grain really does provide some protein that adds up. Even, you know, vegetables provide protein in small amounts. I definitely don't think you can get all of your protein just from eating fruits and vegetables. You definitely can't. I think that's a myth even in the vegan community that whatever plants you're eating, you're going to automatically be getting enough protein from them. I don't think that's true. And so I wouldn't be surprised that somebody who goes on a fruitarian style of eating, where they're usually, you know, just eating fruit, or kind of like Marissa was saying earlier, you're just eating fruits and vegetables, maybe some nuts, you know, kind of like a raw food diet. I really don't recommend that style of eating because I don't think it's nutritionally balanced. I don't think you're going to be getting all the nutrients that you need. Certainly not the protein that you need. And I guess in terms of more of the kind of like more processed protein sources on a vegan diet, I usually recommend that people limit those in the diet. I don't think you have to totally avoid them. And there is a lot of difference, you know, between the different brands and products in terms of their nutrition profile. So I do think things like the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger, they tend to be higher in saturated fat than a lot of the other meat products that we have. And so I don't want them to make up a big part of anybody's diet. You know, especially if you're trying to go vegan for health reasons. You don't really have too much of that saturated fat in your diet. But I think once in a while,
sorry, where does the saturated fat come from? Because it's not real meat. So where is it?
Right,
yeah,
it's not from meat. It's coming from coconut oil typically. Is what's added to both of these.
So there's coconut oil, which is saturated fat, but there's also lots of seed oils, which is polyunsaturated fat.
Yeah, so it's not 100% saturated fat, but the main fat is from coconut oil. I think it helps give it, you know, kind of that similar texture to beef. And I guess something else Marissa mentioned earlier was, and I think this is a common like question people have: why do vegans want to eat foods that look like meat if they don't want to eat meat? And I think that's, you know, that's a fair question. I would differ, where I would say it's not because we are biologically programmed to want to eat meat and that's why vegans gravitate towards these foods. I think it's more of the fact, you know, just in my own experience and experience talking with other vegans, you know, I think most of us grew up eating meat, you know, kind of like a typical American diet. It's, you know, foods that are very familiar to us. A lot of the time, our family members still eat those kinds of foods. Our friends, you know, when we're going out to eat at a restaurant, that's what other people are eating around us. If you go to a potluck, that's what people are bringing. And so really having these options, I think the biggest benefit of it is that they promote social connectivity, you know, when we go out to eat. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of a vegan diet is, you know, going out with others, wanting to have a good time, but, you know, the restaurant you're at doesn't really have any vegan options. They might have like a side salad and French fries, you know, something like that. And that can be kind of, you know, challenging. You want to feel like you're part of the group, but you don't want to, you know, feel like you're burdening people or making things weird, you know, because you're not, you know, eating something normal like they are. So they really provide, I guess, a similar like texture, similar flavor experience. A lot of vegans didn't go vegan because they didn't like the taste of meat. It was because they didn't want to support animal agriculture, or they wanted to, you know, support the environment, things like that. So they can really, I think, fill in the gap when it comes to eating socially with others. And it's really easy for restaurants to add them to their menus. A lot of times restaurants don't know what to do if they're trying to come up with a vegan option. They don't know what to add. If you give them like a Beyond Burger, they know what
aubergine,
to do.
fried aubergine.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think that's really the main reason vegans gravitate towards them. It provides a sense of kind of familiarity, makes it easier to eat out with others.
Mhm. I've also, so I read blog post where you mentioned that soy actually causes your estrogen levels to go up, and there's potential for cancer if you eat too much soy. And you say that that's misinformation.
Yeah, that's definitely misinformation. I think that's still a common myth that's out there. So yeah, a lot of people are under the impression that soy increases estrogen in your body, may decrease testosterone in men, can lead to, the development of cancer because it's interfering with your body's hormones.
Yeah.
And that's really just not true. Um, Soy doesn't contain mammalian estrogen. It contains phytoestrogens, which is a plant form of estrogen. It looks very similar to the estrogen that we produce in our bodies, but it actually works a little bit differently. So plant-based estrogen, kind of depending on the area of the body, it can either act as estrogen or it can act opposite to estrogen.
Mm-hmm.
And so in tissues like the breast, when we're talking about breast cancer, phytoestrogens can actually block your body's estrogen from binding to the same cells in that area. And that's why we see actually some decreased risks of breast cancer and other cancers, typically hormone-based cancers with soy consumption. So it's really not a concern. I know they've also done studies where they look to see if men who consume soy have lower testosterone levels, and they just didn't see that that was the case.
Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't say that men and women should eat different amounts of soy because of their different hormone levels? You think it doesn't matter?
No, I wouldn't say that. And I would say that we can also look at, Asian cultures like Japan, China, where they eat a lot of soy products. And actually, Okinawa, Japan is one of the 5 original blue zones. So I don't think we've talked about blue zones, but these are areas of the world where we see the highest rates of people who live to be 100 years old. And, they took these different areas. So one's Okinawa, Japan. One is Loma Linda in California, where they have a large Seventh-day Adventist population. They tend to eat vegetarian or vegan. You have Sardinia in Italy and a couple others. And so they look to see, what factors these places have in common to try to discover, why is it that people are living so long here? And one of the things that they have in common is that they all eat a primarily plant-based diet. They're not, 100% vegan or vegetarian, but they eat meat in very small amounts. And there's other things that they have in common too. It's not just diet. They tend to be very physically active. They tend to live in communities where they have a lot of social support and structure, so that decreases stress levels. So it's not just diet, but they do all have that kind of theme in common.
Mm-hmm. Marissa, do you have anything to say that?
I do. So I have researched blue zones. I think that they were cherry picked, very similar to other nutritional research that's being touted by the media. So there were areas with high levels of centurions that were not included in the list of blue zones. For instance, Hong Kong has some of the highest meat consumption in the world and the highest levels of centurions, so people who live to be over 100 years old. This was left out of the blue zone study. And so I think that the people who did this research and released it had an agenda towards plant-based diets. And so they cherry-picked research. This is really common. In fact, the man who developed the theory that a bacon cheeseburger will give you a heart attack, his name was Ansel Keys, and he's from my school, the University of Minnesota. And he used something called the 7 country study in the 1950s. He could have used 37 countries, but he cherry-picked 7 to show that the countries that ate the most animal products had the most heart disease. He left out all the confounding factors. This was obviously observational research that shouldn't have come to any conclusions. But these countries that were eating a lot of meat were also eating the highest levels of seed oils, starches, sugars, smoking the most cigarettes. And he cherry-picked, and the research that he was doing was funded by the grain industry. I mean, I live in Minnesota, which is the grain belt of the United States. My professor at my school actually is the carbohydrate expert for the USDA. So she's the one that they refer to when they're creating My Plate or the food pyramid. She does the carbohydrate portion. Her research, I found out while I was at school there, is funded by Coca-Cola, which is a grain product because of high fructose corn syrup. So there's a lot of corruption in the nutrition world. It's actually mind-blowing how much corruption there is. Because in the US, there's almost no federal funding of nutrition research. Most Western countries have taxpayer-funded nutrition research. We do not. So for instance, Coca-Cola alone funds twice as much nutrition research as the United States government. And if you think about who creates the food pyramid, it's the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. So it's corporate grain farmers telling us what to eat, not Health and Human Services. So of course they're putting 11 servings of grains at the bottom of the food pyramid, despite the fact that humans don't have a gizzard and that our ancestors never ate grains. You would never walk up to a wheat berry in the wild and eat it. It's hard as a rock. You can't chew it. We're not designed for these foods. And same with soy. You would never walk up to a soy plant and eat a raw soybean. So these are some of the newest foods to be added to the human diet, and it's only logical that they're causing disease. I firmly disagree that phytoestrogens are not incredibly damaging to the human body. There's plenty of evidence, interventional RTC studies showing that the highest consumptions of soy are the people that have the most cancer and the most breast cancer. And, plants in general are trying to kill us. Plants do not have the ability to run away the way that animals do. So plants create toxins and chemicals. There are 600 different plant toxins. We've already discussed some of them today. Gluten is a really well-known one. Lectins, we've talked about phytoestrogens. There's oxalates, phytates, there's tannins, saponins. There's 600 of these plant toxins. Caffeine is a plant toxin. And the plants put these toxins in their leaves and stems and primarily the seeds so that it deters animals from eating them. So it makes the animals sick. And, humans didn't eat plant parts except for fruit historically. So now we're consuming these more toxic parts of the plants, and levels of not only obesity, metabolic disease like diabetes and heart disease are rising exponentially, but so are digestive diseases and autoimmune diseases, both of which derive from gut damage and from damaged bacteria, gut dysbiosis, which Stephanie alluded to earlier. This is a real area of specialty for me. So I not only work with diet and nutrition with my clients, but I also help my clients heal their guts. Not only do we have dysbiosis, so we have too much harmful bacteria and not enough beneficial bacteria, but we also have damage to the gut lining. So there's actually gap junctions, they're called, leaky gut, where this damage has happened to the lining, where food particles can leak through the leaky gut into the bloodstream. Often these are pieces of protein. And when they leak into the bloodstream, the body sees this protein, thinks it's a pathogen, and attacks it. Or lectins, like gluten is a lectin. These are a very common class of plant toxins from grains. They actually attach to the gut lining and they cause all kinds of problems. They are not broken down by heating. That's incorrect. They pass right into the bloodstream and the body elicits an immune response, thinking it's fighting a pathogen, but there's no pathogen there. And the body ends up attacking itself. And that's how we develop autoimmune disease. There's numerous people. I have clients myself. There's a plethora of people in my community that have been able to put their autoimmune disease into complete remission by removing plant foods from their diet. So, the evidence is incontrovertible that not only did humans historically eat really high levels of animal products, but that it's these plant toxins that are causing the gut damage and causing these diseases. And there's a graph in my seed oil article on my blog that shows that plant fats have gone up, the seed oils. There's three kinds of fat. There's animal fat, which is mostly saturated. There's fatty fruits, which are mostly monounsaturated. So that would be olive oil and avocado oil. And then there's seed fats that are mostly polyunsaturated. So if you look at the graph, you can see that saturated fat consumption has stayed pretty constant over the last 100 years. Monounsaturated, olive oil and avocado oil fats have stayed pretty constant. Seed oil, like I said, has skyrocketed because in 1984, they successfully lobbied to have every deep fryer in America switch to seed oils. And obesity and disease correlate perfectly with seed oil consumption. So, if these diseases are caused by fat, the only fat they could be caused by are polyunsaturated seed oil fats.
I don't know about that. I mean, I remember there was a long period where we had a low-fat craze in the United States. I don't think people were eating really high amounts of seed oils during that time. And yet that's the time where we saw increasing levels of obesity. Really, I think from a lot of the added sugars. I think that was the real danger there, not the seed oils.
So in 1984, they passed a regulation that would make it easier to include seed oils in the diet, and they lobbied the government to do that, or what happened in 1984?
Yep, they successfully lobbied the American government to not only use the media and the food guides to promote seed oil consumption, but they actually encouraged and helped finance every deep fryer in every restaurant in the country to switching over to seed oils. And the thing is, seed oils are incredibly cheap. And restaurant bodies are very thin. And so if there's a very filling, high fat, high caloric, cheap food source like seed oils, restaurants almost have no choice then to use these fats. There's even like traditional French restaurants in the US that, traditionally French cooking was all animal fats, and now they've even switched over to seed oils. There's actually one restaurant in the US, and it's Buffalo Wild Wings, and it uses a 100% beef tallow fryer. It's one of the only restaurants in the US that uses beef tallow. They do it for flavor, I think, but it's one of the only places
you would hope so. Yeah,
my family can go out to eat. Yeah.
Stephanie, what's your take on misinformation and research? That's something that I've taken interest in recently. Right? You always have to look at who's funding it before you decide if you want to believe it or not. So what's your take on that?
I definitely think that is an important issue to look at. I also agree that I think we have too much industry funding of research going on. But I think the issue is a little bit more nuanced. So for example, I know, Marissa mentioned that there isn't as much federal funding of nutrition research as is needed. I think that's definitely true. I do think there are good sources of funding that come from federal sources. My time working in cancer research, we would have funding from the National Cancer Institute, a lot of funding from them. So it's not that the federal government isn't funding nutrition research. I think the issue is that there's so much research that still needs to be done. Overall, there's not enough funding for it. Even with cancer research, I think the funding's getting a little better, but from what I've seen, I think it's important to look at who's funding the studies for sure. But I know that they've done a couple, meta-analysis studies on funding of nutrition research. And what they've really seen is that it's not always so much the issue of who funded the study, as long as the study has a strong study design behind it. So something like a randomized controlled trial where the participants and the assessors are blinded. They don't know who is in what group. Now, with some studies, it's difficult to have complete blinding just based on the thing that they're studying. So you can't always have that. But yeah, from what I've seen from these different studies talking about this, as long as the study has a very strong study design, it's a high quality design. The industry funder was not involved in the study design, or the study results, the data analysis. We can be fairly confident in the results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I just want to explain that, it's not sensical that the funding doesn't play a part. I mean, the funding sources, these corporate companies that are funding this research, they decide not only what research gets done, but they decide what gets published. And the corruption goes all the way to the journals. I mean, for instance, like I said, my nutrition professor was funded by Coca-Cola. In my nutrition class, in my graduate's training, I was in class one day, and she told us that if your child has failure to thrive, so your child is not growing, they're in the bottom 5 percentile of height and weight, that you should feed your child unlimited margarine and frosting. It literally says that in my textbook. And my professor stood in front of the class and told us to feed the child unlimited margarine and frosting to a room full of potential nutritionists. So the corruption is acute. And for example, I got my nutrition license from the American Nutrition Association. I had to take a 4-hour exam, multiple choice. The main funders for the American Nutrition Association are Nestle, Pepsi, and Kellogg's. They are the funders. And so on my exam, I had to put the wrong answer down for many of the questions because I knew what they were looking for because I'd taken
that's crazy.
And I knew what answer they wanted me to put. And there are people who know at the top. In fact, some of those questions had the right answer as one of the options on the multiple choice. And I had to literally put the wrong answer so that I would pass the exam. Then I went a couple years later to renew my nutrition license. And they said, do you want, this is for my federal license. So this is, I'm a certified nutrition specialist, which is the federal nutrition license. They said, do you want the regular nutrition license or do you want our new and improved ketogenic nutrition license? And I was like, excuse me, because their science includes a diet that's like 60 to 70% carbohydrate, plant-based. So how are they now giving out ketogenic nutrition licenses? So I took their 100-hour class and the 2-hour exam for the, now I'm a certified ketogenic nutrition specialist as well. And this class was written by all the scientists that I follow, completely contradicting all of the information that I was given during my entire education. Then I had to take another exam, some of the same questions, but now I had to put the right answer as the response for the multiple choice in order to pass the exam. So it's like we're watching the system crumble in real time. And these people up at the top are starting, they're trying to capitalize off of this information. They can't keep it undercover anymore. I mean, the nutrition research coming out in the last 10 years is so clear because they're getting better at it. There's people who are doing research that don't have these corrupt funding sources. And, if you look at, my son came home last week and he said, Mom, my school is doing a fundraiser for the American Heart Association. Can we donate money so my class wins a prize? And I just knew immediately, I was like, there's almost no way that I'm going to agree with their politics. So I looked. You can literally look yourselves at the Wikipedia page for the American Heart Association. They are funded by Procter & Gamble, who are the makers of Crisco, which is a plant-based fat derived from cottonseed oil. Then Crisco was developed after World War I. This is in my article that I wrote on my blog last month. Crisco literally was formed when they tried to figure out a way to use machine lubricant from World War I, cottonseed oil, and figure out a way to continue selling it after the war. So they turned it into human food, cottonseed oil, machine lubricant. This is the #1 cause of heart disease. And these are the funders of the American Heart Association. I mean, the corruption is like so extreme, you just can't make this stuff up. And so you can't believe anything these people say. I mean, I'm a capitalist, but I also believe in some socialist checks on capitalism because, we have something called groupthink. That means that a group of people who are financially driven are going to have much lower morality than any one person. And there's people who know. There are people at the top who know, and they are keeping us sick on purpose because there's so much corporate greed and there's so many systems that are profiting off of us not only eating tons of grains and beans, the entire middle of the grocery store is all grains and beans and seed oils. This is not food our ancestors ate. This isn't even food our grandparents ate. And then we all get sick. We all have diseases. They're putting 50 to 75% of old people on statins because of the food that they're feeding us. Big Pharma is profiting off of this, and the entire system is profiting off of it. They don't want us to figure out the truth, which is that you can buy a cow from a farmer and feed off of it for an entire year. You don't even need to go to the grocery store, really. And you'll have perfect health. Your diseases will go away. The weight will fall off, and you'll live to be 120 like our ancestors did with all of their teeth. Our teeth are not supposed to fall out of our heads.
No, I mean, what's crazy to me is seeing Kellogg's Frosted cereals as the #1 choice for breakfast for kids in the food pyramid, right? Like so much sugar, obviously unhealthy. And a lot of parents actually believe that and think that giving kids sugar for breakfast is a good choice. So that's just crazy to me. Yeah.
No protein, and protein is the most important nutrient for the human body. I mean, that's a scientific fact. We absolutely need protein. Stephanie's even talked about how to create complete proteins as a vegan or vegetarian. You have to take all these different foods and combine them all together. Like what scores 100 on the protein scale is red meat and eggs. They are literally the exact amino acids in the exact percentages that the human body requires, because we've been eating them for hundreds of thousands and if not millions of years. So I don't have to combine different foods to come up with a complete protein. I wake up and I eat eggs for breakfast and I eat red meat for dinner every single day, and I'm the healthiest I've ever been. I've lost 70 pounds and kept it off for 8 years, which not many people do.
That's awesome. Congratulations. So we talked about diseases, and I think we both agree that there's been an uptake in diseases like diabetes, obesity, heart attacks, and so on. And Marissa touched upon the cause, which is the increased ingestion of seed oils. Stephanie, what's your take on this? Why do you think we have such an uptake of autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease, IBS, and so on?
Yeah, I think I think the uptake in all these diseases is multifactorial. I think there's a lot of different reasons for it. I don't think you can distill it down just to the consumption of seed oils. I think that's overly simplistic, and I don't think that that's supported by the scientific evidence that we have. I think a big contributor is just the lifestyle that is so common in westernized countries, in the US especially. We have very high intakes of added sugars. We have very high intakes of fried fatty foods, very high in saturated fat. We don't exercise as much as we should. I think it's only about 3% of Americans get the recommended amount of dietary fiber, which is important for regulating blood sugar, preventing the development of insulin resistance, which can then lead to type 2 diabetes, keeping our arteries healthy, lowering our blood cholesterol. I think it's a combination of poor diet quality, poor exercise, and also poor stress management strategies that are in place. I think it's very stressful to live in westernized countries. We're so well off, and yet so many people are struggling with anxiety, mental health issues, because I don't think we have really the structural social support that we need. We have all of these issues like, healthcare, the cost of living going up, wages not keeping up with that, people stressing about paying their bills, that I don't think you always see in other countries that are also developed. So I think it's just a combination of all of these things. I think we're too stressed. We don't get enough physical activity, and we're not eating enough plant-based foods.
But would you say the mental health pandemic, would you say mental health is cause or disease, cause or symptom, right? Like does bad diet lead to bad mental health, or is it the other way around?
Right. So I know from the research that they've done so far, it seems like it's more of a bi-directional relationship. So in some people, maybe the first contributing factor was a poor diet, leading them to feel poorly, and that impacts their mental health because they feel sick. But then in other people, it might be really more of a mental health issue that starts first, and because of that, because of them having to deal with this issue, they're not able to, put forth the effort that it takes to, cook meals at home, or even just the mental energy to think about what they're going to be eating that day. So it's really bidirectional. I don't think one is always the first contributing factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Marissa, what do you say? What do you think is the main cause of autoimmune diseases? And you said seed oils is a huge contributor. Anything else you would add?
No, actually not seed oils. So there's 3 families of disease that I treat. There's chronic disease, that's the metabolic diseases we've been talking about, which includes diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancer, stroke, high blood pressure. Then there's autoimmune disease, which you were mentioning, which is Crohn's, colitis, arthritis. SIBO is the fastest growing autoimmune disease right now, celiac. SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So this is fiber intolerance. It's basically way too much bacteria, both beneficial and harmful, in the small intestine. And then the 3rd family of diseases are digestive diseases. So these are the IBS, the stomach diseases. There's a lot of crossover between digestive and autoimmune because they're both starting in the gut. So I think that all 3 are caused primarily by eating seed foods that our ancestors never ate. But the chronic diseases have a lot more connection to the seed oils. So it's the vegetable oils, these fryer oils that we've been using since 1984. The way that it works is that these seed oils are incredibly oxidizable. They're polyunsaturated, so they have multiple places on the fat that have bends. Those bends are a lack of hydrogen atoms, so the molecule can attach to oxygen. So these are free radicals. These are, basically causing an electron transfer through the arterial lining. And the reason that cholesterol has been blamed for heart disease for so long is because when they started looking at people who died of heart attacks, they were seeing cholesterol in the artery. It wasn't actually the cholesterol. Well, first of all, cholesterol in our blood is not from the food that we eat. 80% of the cholesterol in our blood, our body made. Our body.
Well, there are 2 types of cholesterol. There's LDL and then there's HDL, right?
Yeah, there's actually multiple forms of LDL as well.
Yeah.
So it's the small, dense LDL, the VLDL, that's really harmful. And the body was actually reacting to this frying of the arteries from vegetable oil by bandaging the wound with cholesterol. Cholesterol is a healing immune product that the body uses to heal wounds. And then they were seeing this cholesterol building up in the arteries. So the cholesterol itself is not the problem. Our body created the cholesterol in our blood. Your brain is made out of cholesterol. It's a very healthy molecule created by the human body. And so, the damage from the seed oils is the cause of these metabolic diseases, but it's actually other components of the seeds that are causing the gut damage that's leading to digestive disease and autoimmune disease. And it's not only the seeds, but it's also like the pesticides that we spray on the crops. Roundup has been, glyphosate, it has been shown to have very strong correlation with celiac and other wheat diseases. Wheat is the most sprayed crop in the world. They actually spray the wheat crops with glyphosate right before harvest because it increases the seed yield. The plant is being poisoned and it excretes a bunch of extra seeds. And so this increases yield. So when we're eating most wheat products, we're getting a huge dose of glyphosate, which is incredibly damaging to the gut bacteria and the gut lining. And then also antibiotics. I mean, every time we take antibiotics, it's incredibly irresponsible of Western medicine to not also prescribe an antifungal because we're creating fungal overgrowth every time we take these medicines. And there's evidence that it takes 4 to 7 years for the body to heal from the damage from antibiotics. And they're handing them out like candy. I mean, I saw one study where like the average American child gets antibiotics 30 times before they graduate from high school.
That's crazy.
With no antifungals, there's no healing going on. So most of the clients that I work with, if you go in and get a gut test done, it shows very high levels of harmful bacteria, very low levels of beneficial. We have completely different gut bacteria than tribal cultures. We're missing entire species. There's some evidence every time we take antibiotics, we lose 1 or more species of gut bacteria entirely. And so the very first thing I do with most of my clients is to put them on some herbal antifungals and antibacterials, introduce beneficial bacteria, which I actually use fermented foods rather than probiotic pills. I think probiotic pills are a racket and completely, non-effective. So fermented cucumber is actually the best source of beneficial bacteria. And so
kimchi is a good one.
Kimchi is pretty good too, yeah. And so that's a big part of healing the gut lining, is to kill off the harmful organisms and introduce beneficial organisms. And then I also put my clients on bone products. Bone is incredibly healing to the gut lining. So there's all kinds of evidence that our ancestors ate a lot of bone marrow, and that even the Inuit make bone broth. The Inuit are fascinating. They eat mostly animal products 9 months of the year, and they have absolutely no heart disease or diabetes or obesity. So another observational huge chink in the theory that animal foods cause disease. But our ancestors ate a lot of bone, and bone has, all kinds of nutrients in it that you can't get from plant foods, like collagen, gelatin, glucosamine, chondroitin. And when we consume bone products, our bodies can actually create new intestinal lining cells.
Oh, wow.
So this helps to heal the gap junctions and the leaky gut and put autoimmune and digestive diseases into remission.
How do you get diagnosed with this? Is it a stool test? Is it a colonoscopy? How do you know that you have an autoimmune disease? Because those are usually silent diseases, which have very, very variable symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Western medicine does really well is diagnosis. I think they're really bad at a lot of gut diseases, and they are really not very knowledgeable about fungal overgrowth and gut dysbiosis. But a lot of my clients come to me because they have been diagnosed accurately, but they have not been treated, and their disease is not healing. I mean, a lot of autoimmune diseases, Western medicine will put you on medications like biologics that you have to take for the rest of your life. These are incredibly expensive. Some of these shots they have to get monthly, and they're like $50,000 to $100,000 per shot. And so Western medicine, big pharma is making huge profit off these medications, but they're not getting at root cause. Their doctor's not even telling them to stop eating wheat, which is the number one way to put and reduce autoimmune disease symptoms, is to just take grains out of the diet, which are linked to not only celiac, but all other gluten sensitivity diseases, which is the majority of autoimmune disease. So, you can get diagnosed. A lot of my clients have given up on Western medicine and are ready to work with me because their doctor can't help them. So opt-in, I do order tests. I use like Quest Diagnostics to help my clients get tests for things, but I'm actually more of a fan of elimination diet. And I don't think diagnosis is that important, really, because we're all healthy in the same way. We're all unhealthy in unique ways. Basically, wherever disease shows up in the body is just where your body's weakest link happens to be. And so I don't tell people to eat very different diets most of the time. I tell them, return to the diet that your ancestors ate so that your body can heal itself. We all need to introduce beneficial bacteria. We all need to heal our gut lining. We all need to return to the foods that our ancestors ate, the ways that our bodies evolved over millions of years. And then disease heals and excess weight falls off. And a lot of my clients, because I'm a licensed nutritionist, I can legally read blood work. I do recommend people go in, and I have a list of tests that I recommend that they get, or I can order them if they don't have a GP. And then we read their blood work. I'm really looking a lot less for some of the things that regular doctors are looking for. Like, I don't believe total cholesterol or LDL numbers are very accurate biomarkers for disease. So I'm looking at more like A1C and blood sugar numbers. I'm really interested in triglycerides and HDL. These are all numbers that in actual interventional studies have been shown to be a lot more accurate for disease. But a lot of times autoimmune, it doesn't really matter which autoimmune disease you've been diagnosed with. If you have gut problems, you have gut damage. If you have autoimmune, you have gut damage. And so healing the gut is the way to put all of these diseases into remission.
So bone broth and removing grains is a good way to heal your gut.
Good start.
It's a good start.
But my gut health protocol, I've developed a gut health protocol over the years. It's to 5 parts: kill off harmful bacteria and fungus, add in beneficial bacteria, starve the harmful bacteria. So I recommend only eating carbohydrates that are single sugars that don't require digestion. Immediately.
Which is what?
fruit and honey, and squash and some other non-toxic plants. And then, so we kill, add in beneficial, starve them out. We do the bone products that help to develop the new gut lining. And then there's an enzyme blend that I recommend. And all these products are on my website. I have a product recommendations page with links to them. But the enzyme blend called Interphase is the one I really like. It's biofilm disruptor. So harmful bacteria and fungus create biofilms. They're literally carbon matrices in the intestinal lining that the organisms can go dormant. So, you eat an anti-candida diet, you're not actually killing the candida. It can go dormant. They've shown for thousands of years. And then as soon as there's a food source, it pops back to life. Wow. So we have to actually break up, I jokingly call it burning the house down. We need to break up these biofilms and remove them from the intestines while we kill them off. It's really good to work with a professional while you're doing these kinds of things because there's a phenomenon called die-off. The scientific term is a Herxheimer reaction. Basically, it's a healing crisis. We get a little better before, or worse before we get better, because as we're killing off these harmful organisms, the body has to detoxify them. And this can show up as symptoms, yeast, basically, like skin rashes, dandruff, athlete's foot, digestive upset while the body's detoxifying. So I work really closely with my clients. Most of the time I recommend that they work with my membership so that they have daily contact with me while they're starting the supplement protocol, so I can keep a close eye on their symptoms. And, you want to have a little bit of diet so it's working, but you still want to be comfortable and be able to function.
Yeah.
So it's a delicate art.
This is super informative. Thank you. Stephanie, what's your take on healing from autoimmune diseases?
Sure. So I think that a plant-based diet can come in handy for some people. I know vegans who have seen their IBS much improved or even going into remission. So I don't think it's really accurate to say that it's the plant-based foods that are causing these digestive diseases in people, especially when we know how healthy dietary fiber is for the gut. Dietary fiber is incredibly important for increasing the amount of beneficial bacteria in your microbiome.
What is insulin resistance? Because I've heard that term a lot, and I know it comes from eating too much glucose, which then our hormone insulin can't really transport to the cells to feed it, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So when people talk about insulin resistance, they're talking about the way that your body is reacting to insulin. So insulin is a hormone that's produced by your pancreas. It's what circulates in your bloodstream and actually helps your body's cells take up glucose from your bloodstream into the cells to be used as energy. That's why we say, carbohydrates are the body's preferred source of energy. So what happens in insulin resistance is that your body is less responsive to insulin, and therefore more of the glucose in your bloodstream just stays in your bloodstream rather than getting uptaken into your body cells to be used for energy. And that can lead to high blood sugar over time. Typically, when you have insulin resistance for a long period of time, it can then develop into type 2 diabetes. I would say a common misconception is that diabetes and insulin resistance is caused just by eating too much sugar or too many carbs. We know it's a little bit more complicated than that. And actually, one thing that has been shown to play a role in insulin resistance is very high intakes of saturated fat. They're thinking that it can promote inflammation in some part. And we tend to see insulin resistance happening with high levels of inflammation in the body. It might not just be due to, a high intake of saturated fat. It could be due to other things. It could be due to extremely high stress levels, not eating enough anti-inflammatory foods like fruits and vegetables, which contain antioxidants and phytochemicals. So that's what insulin resistance is.
Mm-hmm. So I think we disagree, we disagree here on fats and what fats are good and bad for you, but we do agree that added sugar is definitely bad bad thing to eat and ingest. And unfortunately, most of our foods have added sugar, right? It's everywhere in everything.
Yeah,
So that's
it's
something
definitely
to
in a lot
avoid.
of products. Yeah.
I actually
Cool.
don't
Yeah.
agree with that anymore. I'm kind of coming around on sugar. So I actually wrote my master's dissertation on sugar, on fructose and glucose, and I did a meta-analysis on the studies that exist comparing glucose and fructose and disease biomarkers in the body. And I didn't find a lot of correlation. My paper basically said I couldn't find much of a difference. And, the more I research seed oils and the more evidence that's come out in the last 10 years around seed oils, it really looks like they are the primary cause of these metabolic diseases that all are based in blood sugar issues in the body. So the way I like it said, Brad Marshall is one of my favorite scientific nutrition researchers. He's also a hog farmer. He's a really cool guy. He's got a blog called Fire in a Bottle. And he said that seed oils light the fire that sugar feeds. So sugar is not necessarily the problem. The problem is, like I said, the cells are made out of fat. Okay, we have a phospholipid bilayer around the wall of each cell. And these fats are made out of the ones that we eat. So when we're eating these weak, oxidizable, polyunsaturated fats and the cells are made out of that, the things on the cell lining are becoming damaged. And the GLUT4 receptor is the insulin receptor that allows carbohydrates to come into the cell to be burned. Stephanie said that sugar, glucose is the preferred fuel for the human body. I disagree. Actually, the brain and nervous system are the only parts of the body that need glucose. The rest of the body prefers fat. And our ancestors ate primarily fat. We are fat burners. And I think part of the problem is that we're now forcing the human body to digest so much carbohydrate, and these cells are damaged from the seed oils. So the metabolism becomes broken. The mitochondria can no longer digest the carbohydrates correctly. And when the mitochondria breaks, that's what leads to cancer. That's why cancer cells can only digest glucose and not fat, because they're damaged. But, a high-fat diet is what I recommend. I think if we were metabolically flexible, we're able to switch from fat burning to sugar burning. So like I said, I eat meat and fruit. I'm not in ketosis. I did the keto diet for a long time, but I found that there's some mineral deficiencies associated with ketogenic diet, because digesting carbohydrates does help the body retain minerals. So, the problem is not sugar. I actually have returned to, recommending to my clients, once you've healed your gut, once your autoimmune and digestive disease is in remission, once you've lost excess body weight, you're at your goal weight, a little bit of organic cane sugar is not the worst thing. And what happens is, my body, I ate carbohydrates, I would gain weight. I come from a family that has a lot of obesity. And like I said, I've lost a lot of weight myself. And for a long time, I did that by eating a ketogenic diet because my body could not digest carbohydrates without weight gain. And the reason was because of insulin. I had damage to my insulin receptors. So when I would eat carbohydrates, my body, it's not the blood sugar that's actually the problem. It's the high insulin that's the problem. So the body has too much blood sugar, releases too much insulin, and then we get into the swings of the hyperglycemia with the hypoglycemia. So we have too much insulin, our blood sugar actually falls too low. That's when people get shaky and need to eat carbohydrates because they're having like almost withdrawal symptoms. So that's actually from excess insulin. And so if we heal the body, we don't need to slap these Band-Aid solutions on like Western medicine so often recommends. We can actually heal the cells. Unfortunately, it takes a really long time to detoxify seed oils from the human body. So seed oils, polyunsaturated fats, have a 680-day half-life. So it takes 2 years to clear half of the stored seed oils out of the human body. But I'm on year 4, and I actually started seeing major differences in my body's ability to digest carbohydrates around the 3-month mark. And I'm an N of 1, but I have a lot of clients that I work with that have very similar experiences, as well as a lot of people in my community. And basically, we detoxify these seed oils, and suddenly the body heals, and the body's able to digest carbohydrates properly, without it causing major fat storage. Other amazing things happen too, like we don't sunburn anymore because the skin isn't damaged by seed oils. I do not use sunscreen at all anymore. And
That's crazy. I didn't know there was this correlation.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. There's some really cool research coming out about the effects of lowered seed oils and not only lack of sunburn, but skin cancer rates go down considerably. I mean, our ancestors lived near the equator and were outside mostly naked most of the day. It doesn't make sense that suddenly the sun is bad for us when it creates vitamin D, a hormone vitamin in the body that we get from the sun.
Yeah.
I'd actually mostly agree about the sugar. I don't think that small amounts of sugar in the diet are typically harmful. I guess where I would disagree is related to cancer cells in sugar. So I think that's a common idea, is that cancer cells run on sugar. So if you're eating carbohydrates when you have cancer, it's not beneficial, right? You're just feeding the cancer. And what that comes from is imaging studies where they've shown that cancer cells do metabolize glucose. So you see the glucose like in the cancer cell, but it doesn't mean it's a little more nuanced. Every cell in your body is able to metabolize glucose. And so that's really what it's showing. It's not showing that the sugar that you eat is going straight to the tumor cell to feed it. And kind of what we were talking about earlier with cancer, I think, Marissa, you mentioned something where you were saying, meat isn't really the problem because tumor cells don't feed on meat. That really isn't the main issue with cancer risk and prevention. A lot of it is the compounds that come when you cook meat. So things like we know that cooking meat at a high temperature, for example, on a grill where you have a flame underneath, it produces these compounds called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and those are considered to be carcinogenic. It might also be in part due to the heme iron that you find in animal products. Animal products have heme iron, plant-based foods have non-heme iron, and heme iron is known to be an oxidant, so it can promote oxidative stress in the body and inflammation. So if you're not getting enough anti-inflammatory foods in your diet, that can all kind of work together to promote an environment in the body where cancer can thrive. But it's really not the fact that cancer runs on sugar. But yeah, I do agree that small amounts of sugar are not necessarily bad. I think that, your body can metabolize them, easily. I think the main issue is when these added sugars are taking up too big of a part of your diet, right? So situations where you're drinking multiple sodas a day, eating a lot of sweets, it's really crowding out, more healthful foods, and just adding a lot of excess calories to the diet as well, so it can cause issues with weight management. So it's really your overall dietary eating pattern and how much sugar you're getting overall, and making sure that you're getting nutrient-dense foods in there as well. But a little sugar once in a while is not bad.
That's good to know. So we talked about vitamin D, and it's, again, something I'm interested in, and vitamins, supplements in general. I take 10,000 IU vitamin D per day because my blood work has shown that I'm really deficient, and I'm super white if you can't see it. I got burned recently pretty badly. So what are your thoughts on vitamins, the vitamin industry, vitamin D? I know that the FDA recommends 1,000 IU. But I just think that's not enough, so I take 10,000. Do you think that's too much? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really recommend that people go over the upper limit, which honestly, I'm blanking a little bit on what the upper level is. But I think it makes sense that if you are deficient, it's going to take more to get you back up to a normal level. So I think that definitely makes sense. I do think that sometimes vitamin D supplementation is talked about as kind of like a cure-all, right? It's like, oh, well, you have all these health problems because you're deficient in vitamin D. And obviously it's bad to be deficient in vitamin D, but I don't think that's causing, so many issues that the people maybe say it does. But yeah.
Well, I am not a big fan of a multivitamin. I think it just creates expensive pee. because your body, it does not need most of those nutrients. They're usually fake versions of a lot of those vitamins. They're not bioavailable. They're things that people aren't getting from their diets because they're not eating meat. I mean, if you look at what's in red meat or organ meats, which I really recommend to most of my clients that they get some kind of an organ meat source, they read like a multivitamin. I mean, red meat has virtually every vitamin, mineral that the human body needs, as well as really high levels of iron. Organ meats have high levels of copper and minerals and micronutrients that the human body needs. So, I'm differing from the vegetarian diet, which requires a lot of supplementation, which virtually has, vegans have absolutely no B12. There's plenty of evidence of massive problems with low B12 and that it's really prevalent. I mean, 40% of Americans have low B12. And it affects young people as well as old. And so just in general, Americans aren't eating enough meat, so we're not getting enough B vitamins. But the only supplements that I recommend for my clients are ones that our ancestors got from food and water and sun, but that because of our lifestyle, we're no longer getting them in high enough amounts. So the only things I recommend are D3. I do recommend 10,000 a day exactly. Okay. There's actually an article about vitamin D on my blog with a bunch of scientific studies linked to it. And one of them is that they did one study where optimal levels were only reached with supplementation of 9,000 a day or more. There actually is no upper limit of vitamin D. There was a family who accidentally was taking vitamin D powder instead of milk powder. And so they were getting 100,000 IUs a day. And they had no negative health effects. There's actually studies that have been done in Western medicine where they've given people doses as high as 600,000 IUs of vitamin D, and there are no negative health effects associated. So, the government tells us, actually, I was surprised when you said it was 1,000, because when I was in school, they were recommending 400 IUs a day. So virtually everyone's walking around majorly deficient, even if they're supplementing, because our ancestors were outside mostly naked near the equator for most of the day every day. So our bodies evolved getting a lot of sun. And, we actually can take something called a vitamin D hammer. It's shown to be almost a miracle cure for the flu, for head colds. It's had very effective results in research on COVID. So I recommend that anytime someone is sick, they take a one-time dose of 50,000 IUs of vitamin D. There's actually a study on my blog post that showed they had to ethically stop a study that was being done on the flu with the vitamin D hammer, because the entire treatment group got better and the entire control group got worse. So they had to ethically stop the study early and give the control group the vitamin D hammer so that their flu would improve. But, flu is a seasonal illness. And what season is it? The season of winter, when we're not getting any sun. So I think vitamin D, since I started supplementing high levels of vitamin D, I've not gotten the flu once. I almost never get head colds. My COVID was almost asymptomatic. And I even give it to my children every day. I do recommend a vitamin D hammer as a loading dose for people who haven't been supplementing, just to get your levels up. And not only does the FDA tell us that we only need 400 or 1,000 a day, but they tell us that levels of 30 are adequate. I think the evidence shows that we need levels closer to 100, which is what mine are. And when I went in and got my blood work done, my doctor told me, please stop supplementing vitamin D. Your levels are too high. And I was like, I'm good. Thank you. I actually bring studies in to show my doctor all the time. She's got a pretty open mind. But just to close up, the only other supplements that I recommend are beef organs. So there's a beef organ blend I recommend that's not only liver, but heart, pancreas, and spleen. Like I said, the bone supplements, I really like just taking bones as a pill rather than, I do actually have a pot of bone broth on the stove right now. And I love marrow. It is really good, but it's a lot of work to make that all the time. So a lot of times my clients just choose to take bone pills. And then I think minerals are something that almost everyone needs to supplement, because our ancestors drank mineral water, from the ground. And now most of us drink city water that's been purified. They're taking out the toxins, but they're also taking out the minerals. So, I think we get enough calcium from the bone supplements, but I think most people need to supplement magnesium, potassium, zinc, a lot of these other micronutrients and minerals that we don't get from the water or from the soil. So it's not in the foods even that the animals are eating if we eat a high meat diet. So these are all things that historically we would have gotten from food and water and sun, but now we need to supplement because of lifestyle.
Yeah, I'd agree that I don't think most people really need to take a multivitamin. I think in general, if you're eating a well-balanced diet, you're going to be getting most of the nutrients you need. And, taking a multivitamin if you're not deficient in something, yeah, it's kind of expensive pee, especially with the water-soluble vitamins that you don't store. If you already have enough, you're just going to excrete them. In terms of B12, yeah, B12 is really interesting. So we used to be able to get B12 from plant-based foods because it used to be more prevalent in the soil that they grew in. But now our soil is a lot more depleted. And so the B12 just isn't there. And so that's why they do, there are some fortified foods with B12. So you don't always have to take a supplement as long as you're including some of the fortified foods. And so that would be things like most non-dairy milks have B12 in them. Nutritional yeast is a fortified food. Or you can take a supplement, you can kind of go either way. I don't think it hurts anybody to take a B12 supplement because deficiency is pretty common, not just in vegans. Even meat eaters can have a B12 deficiency. Sometimes there's issues with your body's ability to absorb it. So even if you're not getting enough through food, maybe it's an absorption issue. So B12 is interesting. I don't think everybody needs to be taking multivitamin supplements. And I think there's kind of I think people are pretty misinformed about supplements. They think that taking more of a nutrient is always better. And so, why not, have that insurance, I guess. Yeah, why not load up? Yeah. But yeah, there are some nutrients where if you get too many of them, it can cause, negative health effects. And if you're not deficient, it might just not be helpful. So, it might not be dangerous, but you might just be wasting your money, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, the pharma industry profits of it, so makes sense why they're selling so hard.
I just wanted to say too that I really disagree that you can get B12 from plant sources or that it's a soil issue. There's plenty of evidence that there's absolutely no B12 in plants and that it's only a nutrient a vitamin that you can get from meat products.
Right. I'm sorry what I meant was that there used to be B12 present in the soil in plant-based foods, but yeah, now the soil is so depleted we can't get B12 from plant-based foods.
What you said, I just really disagree. I don't think that plants uptake B12, and I don't think when we consume plants, even when it's present in the soil, that we get, it's a scientific fact that B12 is only present in animal foods. The other vitamin that's only present in animal foods is K2. K2 is a really interesting vitamin. So I'm talking about K2MK7, which is the form only found in animal foods that's more bioavailable for the human body. And studies are coming out now showing that K2 is really coupled with calcium absorption. So as you know, there's really high levels of osteoporosis and calcium deficiency in Americans. And this is largely, I think, due to K2 deficiency. K2 is most prevalent in butter, is the highest food source. It's also present in animal meats and fats. And K2 helps the body to absorb and hold on to the calcium and put it into the bones and teeth where it belongs. There's actually some really cool evidence coming out about K2 supplementation being helpful for dental health because plaque and tartar on the teeth are largely caused from excretions of calcium in the saliva. So if the body's able to hold on to the calcium rather than excreting it into the mouth, then the teeth are able to have lower levels of tartar and plaque. And so dental carie rates go down considerably with K2 supplementation. I actually found this myself. So I don't get cavities, but I'm a person who has high tartar. So I have to get my teeth cleaned a lot. And I was wondering, I eat such a great diet. I don't ever get cavities, but why do I have all this tartar? And so I did this research. I found this evidence about K2. So I started supplementing. And the next time I went to the dentist, my hygienist said, wow, your tartar levels are so much lower than normal. And so it's an N1 experiment, but I still think it's fascinating that I was able to see a difference in my own body.
Awesome. Good to know. So many people choose to be vegan, also for the animal welfare and climate change reasons. And I wanted to touch upon those quickly. So some argue that, meat eaters contribute to climate change, and we could reduce emissions by not eating meat, and especially cows, when they chew, when they fart, they produce methane, which contributes to climate change. Marissa, you argue the opposite. You say that cows are actually carbon neutral or even carbon negative. So let's talk about this argument. I think, Stephanie, if you want to start, and we can then move on.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, you're right. I think a big reason people go vegan is for the benefits it can have for the environment. So one thing that we've seen is that animal agriculture as a whole contributes more greenhouse gas emissions than even the entire transportation industry alone. So including, every kind of transportation, buses, cars, airplanes, trains. Animal agriculture provides more of an impact to the climate than transportation. And I think that's for a lot of different reasons. So it's not just because of the methane, but it's also because of the pollution that you get from, factory farms. They're also called concentrated animal feeding operations, like the more technical term for them. You see a lot of pollution into groundwater, surrounding lakes. We also see just really high amounts of water that are required, both for the cattle to drink, but more importantly, or maybe more of an impact, is the water that it takes to grow the crops that you then feed to the animals. And that takes a lot of water. It takes a lot of land. And based on the fact that we have such high demands for meat in Western countries, especially the United States, the demand is just so high that to meet the demand, they have to use these methods like factory farms in order to produce meat at an efficient enough rate. And it really has negative impacts on the environment.
Cool. Marissa?
Yeah. So I think that one of the big areas that Stephanie and I completely are in agreement on are these feedlots and how harmful they are. Like I said, I was a vegetarian and a vegan for a long time. And when I decided through my research that, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers and that I was damaging my body by not eating animal products, when I started eating meat again, I was very careful about my sources because I didn't want to participate in these feedlots. And I do think they're incredibly harmful, not only to the animals, but to the earth as well. And so I buy whole grass-fed cows. My family's up about 2 whole grass-fed cows a year. So we have deep freezers and we buy them straight from the farmer. I've actually researched farms in my area, and I found farms that are not only grass-fed, but that practice regenerative agriculture. So when cows eat grass, if they do it in a managed way, it's called managed rotational grazing or mob grazing, they move the animals to a new field every day. And so the grass is only eaten once rather than being trampled down and killed, which does cause loss of soil. If the cows are raised in a managed way, it actually causes the grass to create topsoil. I've done a lot of research on this. There's an article on my website about it. But basically, the grass has a symbiotic relationship with the soil fungus, and it purchases nutrients from the soil fungus, and it pays the fungus in sugar. Sugar is a 6-carbon molecule, and the way the grass gets the carbon is to pull it out of the atmosphere. So that is why grass-fed beef can often be carbon negative. It's actually reducing the levels of carbon in the atmosphere by building topsoil. So when humans came to North and South America, there was an average of 10 feet of topsoil. I don't know if you've seen the diagrams, but the grass, as tall as it is, there's even more root structure beneath the soil, and it's creating this sugar-rich peat, basically. And now, on average, because of monocropping and because of growing grains and beans, we have an average of 6 inches of topsoil in the US. And this loss of topsoil actually contributes to climate problems because the soil is made of carbon. And when you go from 10 feet to 6 inches, all that carbon is literally going up into the atmosphere. There's actually some scientists who think that soil has added more carbon to the atmosphere than all fossil fuel use combined. And if you think about it, I just think it's ridiculous to insinuate that cows are worse for the environment than gasoline. When humans came to North America, the continent was covered in millions of bison. I mean, this world evolved with these large ruminant animals eating grass with 10 feet of topsoil. And to say that cows are worse for the environment than all of the fossil fuel use or all of this topsoil loss is just nonsensical to me. Cows burping is not worse for the environment than gasoline. Methane is a more warming substance, but it's also in the atmosphere for a lot shorter amount of time. And the cows that are burping methane, that methane is part of a cycle that's existed on this planet for millions of years. That methane comes out of the atmosphere very quickly, whereas carbon stays around a lot longer. And the water that cows use is not aquifer water that we're draining from the system. It's rainfall. And all beef cattle in the US are fed grass for the first 18 months, and they're slaughtered at 2 years. So when you're in the grocery store and you see grass-fed beef and you see regular, not grass-fed beef, which means corn finished, all of those animals ate grass for 18 months. The non-grass-fed beef just finished on corn for the last 6 months. There are dairy cattle that are raised in feedlots from birth, but absolutely no beef cattle in the US that aren't grass-fed for the majority of their lives. And cows eating grass is a natural system that's been on this planet for millions of years. That rainfall is not water that they're using. It's part of this cycle, just like the methane cycle that's just being recycled, that they're immediately putting back into the ground through their waste. So I don't think that cows and animals and eating meat is a contributor to climate change really at all, because if you look at the bigger picture of these cycles, and I think if we choose our meat wisely, we don't participate in feedlots. Like I said, I buy raw milk from a local farmer. I buy grass-fed cows from a regenerative agriculture farm. And I do this because I actually save money from what I would at the grocery store. I have to buy it up front, but it's actually cheaper. And I do this because I want to eat happy, healthy animals. I mean, I don't want to participate in a system that's damaging the environment or creating sad, unhappy, unhealthy animals either.
Yeah. Stephanie, do you have anything to add on the animal welfare or climate change argument?
So I definitely think grass-fed is a better option than factory farming, that method that we have right now. I think the cows unquestionably would have a better quality of life. I do think it's less damaging to the environment for sure. But I guess I just think about the amount of meat that people eat right now. The demand is so high. I don't think that it's really feasible to switch completely to grass-fed beef. I don't think we could meet the demand that people have for meat. And so that's why I think it's important to focus on shifting towards, maybe not 100% vegan diet, but shifting more towards a more plant-based diet. And that's been recommended by, different organizations, the Intergovernmental Council on, I'm blanking on the name, it's the IPCC. They recommended shifting more towards a plant-based diet. They don't recommend a vegan diet, but definitely more focus on plant-based foods to help the environment. So I think without kind of a drastic shift, I don't think we're going to see the improvements that we really need to see to avoid, a real climate catastrophe.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
There's a researcher I really love. His name is Alan Savory. He has a TED Talk. It's one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. He's doing some really fascinating research into regenerative agriculture. And he says that if we put ruminant animals on the Earth's existing grasslands, that we would have more than enough meat to feed everyone on the planet a meat-based diet. So this thing about needing to save humanity with eating plants is false. I also think that most plant-based diets exist on monocropping agriculture. So we're clear-cutting ecosystems in order to grow soybeans and wheat and corn. And this is incredibly damaging to the environment. It not only leads to the loss of that 9.5 feet of topsoil, but it also displaces huge amounts of animals. These crops are sprayed heavily. They're introducing all kinds of toxins and chemicals into the environment, into the food. And more mammals are actually killed during plant agriculture than it requires to eat a meat-based diet. So saying that you're eating vegetarian or vegan for the animals is not actually true. Like there's mammals like mice and bulls, there's birds, there's all kinds of animals in these ecosystems that are clear cut. And when you till that field with the tractor, numerous animals die. And who's to say that a mouse is less important than a cow? I mean, mice sing to their young. When we eat bread, we are participating in the murder of mice, of mammals who take care of their young and are sentient beings. And so my family can live on 1 or 2 cows for the entire year. A plant-based diet is going to participate in a lot more mammal death than what my family is participating in. And that cow was able to live for years. It lived outside, it ate grass, it had a happy life. And so I actually think that even from a moral perspective, an animal-based diet can cause less death than a vegetarian diet. And so to me, there's just not really much of an argument. And, if you want to be a vegan or a vegetarian for the animals, it's your choice. I just think people need to understand that you're reducing your life expectancy by up to half. I mean, a lot of people die of heart disease, diabetes, and these related diseases at like 50 or 60 years old. Life expectancy is falling in the US. And there's mummies with all of their teeth with animal products in their guts that are 120 years old. And that's how long the human body is able to live for. So, if you're doing it for the animals, just know that you're giving up half of your life and that you might actually be killing more animals in the long run.
I mean, I don't think that argument is very accurate. I do know that there are some, small animals that do tend to get unintentionally killed in the harvesting of crops. But when you think about the amount of crops that are actually grown to feed animals, to feed cattle that are being finished on grains, that's where most of that is coming from. So if you choose to stop eating meat, stop eating cows, hopefully eventually there would be less of these crops grown to feed to these animals. And so overall there would be less animal deaths. So I don't know, I don't really think that's a very accurate statement.
You can also just eat grass-fed beef, and then you're not participating in any death except for an older cow that will feed an entire family for a year.
Yeah, I guess that's where people would differ. Some people just don't think animal deaths for any reason are ethical. And so that's where I guess the differences come in.
Yeah. Well, you would have to be like a fruitarian or whatever the term is to like not kill any animal. It's
a breatharian.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, this was so informative. I learned so much. So thank you both for participating. And yeah, we disagree on a lot of things, which fats, which sugars are bad or good for you, but we do agree that highly processed food is definitely bad and we should remove it from our diets and go back to nature and eating more natural foods. So yeah, thank you both. It was really a pleasure speaking with you.
Yes,
thank you, Lucy.
Thanks, Lucy.